Welcome back, fellow overthinker. What if I told you you've never made a single real decision in your life? Not the clothes you wear, not the career you chose, not even the people you love. You've just been reacting, triggered by sounds, colors, patterns, suggestions. You've been trained, like a lab animal, to press the right buttons, say the right words, and call it you. In this video, I'll walk you through 30 psychological exploits that run your life like code. Techniques used by marketers, governments, cult leaders, even your childhood, not to warn you, not to empower you, just to show you how predictable and programmable you really are. Each one will feel small at first, until you realize it's already active in your daily routine. And by the end, you might wonder if you were ever human at all. Settle in, slow your thoughts. Let's begin. Operant conditioning, how dopamine rewards built your every habit. You touch the phone without thinking. There was no conscious decision, no goal, no urgent reason, just a twitch of the hand, a trained movement, a learned behavior. Somewhere deep in your nervous system, a little loop has formed, and it wants its reward. This is operant conditioning, and it's the reason you are, in many ways, just a bundle of rituals held together by dopamine. The idea began with rats. In the 1930s, psychologist B.F. Skinner built a box. Inside the box, a lever. When the rat pressed the lever, it got food. Over time, the rat pressed the lever more and more. Then Skinner added punishment, maybe a mild shock or no food. Suddenly, the rat's behavior changed again. The rat wasn't thinking. It was reacting to outcomes. If a behavior led to pleasure, it repeated. If it led to pain or nothing, it stopped. It's not just rats. Now think about your own life. You check your phone. A notification gives you a like. Dopamine fires. That tiny jolt of pleasure? That's reinforcement. You post again. You check again. You scroll again. You don't need to decide anymore. The decision is gone. The loop is installed. Here's how it works. In the simplest form, action becomes reward. You do it more. Action becomes punishment. You do it less. Action leads to nothing. And eventually, you stop. That's it. That's the skeleton of your entire behavioral life. This process is shaping everything, from the way you brush your teeth to how you fall in love. And yes, even how you form political opinions or handle grief. There are 4 basic types of operant conditioning. Positive reinforcement, give a reward when the action is performed. Negative reinforcement, remove something bad when the action is performed. Positive punishment, add something bad after the action. Negative punishment, take away something good, sound mechanical. That's because it is. You're being calibrated by consequences. Now here's where it gets darker. This conditioning system is quiet. You don't realize it's happening. When your boss compliments you for staying late, that's a little pellet. When a partner gives the silent treatment after you express anger, that's a little shock. When your phone lights up with fake fireworks after a win in a mobile game, that's Skinner's box. Digitized. You are being trained by systems, social, technological, emotional, and most of them were never designed with your freedom in mind. In one classic experiment, pigeons were given food at random intervals, not for any behavior, just random. The pigeons began performing strange rituals, spinning in circles, bobbing their heads, flapping in weird patterns. Why? Because they believed their action had caused the reward. The random reinforcement created superstition. And now think of your own rituals, your lucky shirt before an exam, the exact way you arrange your desk, the way you check your horoscope just in case you're not above the pigeon. Even stranger, many people are trained by pain. Let's say you grow up in a house where expressing sadness gets you yelled at. You learn quickly, quietly, that emotional honesty equals punishment, so you stop. But now you're 35, in therapy, and you wonder why you feel numb. It's not trauma, it's training. You've been operantly conditioned to suppress emotions that once triggered social pain. This is how personality can be shaped. You think you're shy, avoidant, anxious, or even cold. But maybe you're just a dog who learned which tricks got scolded. Even phobias can be installed this way. Touch a stove, feel pain, and now you fear it. Public speaking leads to humiliation, and humiliation becomes dread. And each time, the brain wraps it in memory, avoidance, and an emotional tag. Soon, it's part of who you think you are. But it's just conditioning. Let's talk dopamine. This chemical isn't pleasure exactly. It's anticipation of reward. When you expect something good, a message, a compliment, a cookie, dopamine spikes. When you get it, it drops. Which means you are addicted not to reward, but to expecting it. That's how tech works. That's how capitalism works. That's how modern dating apps work. They train you to chase, never to rest, never to be satisfied, only to press the lever again. Here's the cruel twist. You can be conditioned without anyone doing it to you. Let's say you eat chocolate every time you're sad. Now your brain learns sad leads to eating, leads to feeling just a little bit better. Soon the sadness itself becomes a trigger, a cue. You don't need to think, you just reach. That's why breaking habits feels like withdrawal. You're not quitting a choice. You're trying to interrupt a closed loop. Skinner once imagined a future where society would use this method deliberately to shape ideal citizens, a utopia of compliance. But he underestimated something. You don't need a dictatorship to enforce this. You'll do it to yourself. A parent, a teacher, an algorithm, or a passing comment. All it takes is a few well-timed rewards or punishments, and your behavior starts rewiring. And the worst part? It works. Classical conditioning. Why your anxiety activates when you hear a sound. You're not afraid of the sound. You're afraid of what it meant. That slam of the door. That wasn't just wood and metal. That was the signal. That sound meant yelling was coming. Maybe worse. And now, years later, even in a different house, even with different people, your chest still tightens. No threat, no logic, just tension. This is classical conditioning. It's older than thought. And it's how your body learns to fear things before your mind even has time to explain. It started with dogs. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, was studying digestion. He noticed something strange. His dogs began salivating before food was even presented. Just the sound of the lab assistant's footsteps triggered it. So he ran the experiment. He rang a bell, then gave the dog food. Bell, then food. Bell, then food. Eventually, he rang the bell, and the dog salivated. No food, just the sound. The bell had become a trigger, a conditioned stimulus for a biological response. Here's the formula. Unconditioned stimulus equals food. Unconditioned response equals salivation. Neutral stimulus equals bell. After repeated pairing, conditioned stimulus equals bell. Conditioned response equals salivation. Now erase the dog. Replace it with you. Unconditioned stimulus, pain. Unconditioned response, fear. Neutral stimulus, your father's footsteps, or your teacher's tone, or a ringtone you heard right before being dumped. After enough pairings, the neutral thing is no longer neutral. Now your body flinches before your brain catches up. This is why trauma doesn't always feel like memory. It feels like reaction. Because your body isn't waiting for thought. It learned long ago. You might not remember the incident, but your nervous system does. This is how phobias are born. This is how panic attacks can be triggered by smells, faces, sounds, songs, seasons, colors. And this is how entire belief systems are installed without a single word of explanation. A child hears the name of a certain group spoken in disgust over dinner, paired with tension. They hear it enough times, and the association sticks. They feel revulsion, not because of evidence, not because of ideology, but because of classical conditioning. Same goes for shame. You raise your hand in class and get laughed at once. It's enough. Now the sound of laughter near you, even unrelated, makes your body heat up. You don't raise your hand again. Not because you're shy, But because your brain paired laughter with pain, it's not logic, it's wiring. Even love can be conditioned. If someone makes you feel safe during a crisis, their voice, their face becomes associated with relief. You feel calmer in their presence, even if nothing's changed. You think it's a bond. Maybe it is, but beneath it, it's just the bell, the pairing. And then there's the darker side. Some people will condition you on purpose. It's easy. Create stress, then remove it. Make the environment tense, then offer the relief. Eventually, the person providing the relief becomes associated with safety, even if they're the one causing the pain. This is how abusers become impossible to leave. This is how people stay loyal to cults, toxic bosses controlling lovers. They've been trained, not logically, not emotionally, but biologically. This is the same method used in interrogation tactics, cult indoctrination, and addiction cycles. Pair suffering with the relief. Then let the victim come back willingly for more. Pavlov probably didn't mean to invent a user manual for emotional manipulation, but that's what it became. And you've already experienced it. Why does a certain smell make you feel safe? Why does a song make you tear up? Why does your stomach clench when you hear a ringtone that hasn't belonged to anyone in years? These are not memories. They're body responses, encoded through association. It's powerful. It's invisible. And once installed, it runs for decades. Worse, you can be conditioned without realizing it, even if you never experienced the original event directly. A child raised in a house where fear is in the air doesn't need to witness the trauma. The tension in the room becomes the trigger. Years later, they don't know why they avoid conflict, why loud voices make them shut down. But the bell has already been installed, and they'll salivate, or freeze, or panic every time it rings. This kind of learning bypasses reason. It bypasses reflection. You don't get to consent. It happens quietly, behind your thoughts, in the shadows of sensation. And once a conditioned response is in place, you start organizing your life around avoiding certain bells, certain places, certain people, certain times of year, certain words. You don't know why. You just know they make your body change. And so your world gets smaller, just like a dog that avoids the bowl after it gets sick, just like the child who avoids eye contact after too many flinches, just like you, adjusting your life not around truth, but around associations. All it takes is one wrong pairing, pain linked to something harmless. Now that thing owns you, and you'll call it instinct. But what happens when that instinct becomes contagious? When someone else's fear makes you afraid, when panic spreads faster than reason, when the whole group reacts, before anyone asks why, you've seen it happen. You've felt the unease spread like static in the room. You've watched people change their behavior just because others did. It's not just you reacting anymore, it's the entire system. And it doesn't need conditioning now. It just needs the crowd. Priming, one word can change your next decision. You walk into a room. Someone smiles. They say the word warm, and for some reason, you sit closer to them. You don't know why. You don't think about it. It just feels right. Now imagine a different room. Someone uses the word cold. Same tone, same face, but now you cross your arms. You sit further away. You don't know you've been nudged. You don't feel manipulated, but you've already changed. That's priming, and it works in silence. It's the science of planting subtle cues, words, images, sounds, even smells that shape how you think, how you feel, and what you do next. Without you noticing, let me show you how deep it goes. In one famous study, researchers gave participants a list of words to unscramble. That's it. Just rearrange some sentences. But for some, the words included things like Florida, old gray, and retired. Those people walked slower down the hallway, not because anyone told them to, because they'd been primed with ideas of aging. The brain took the hint. The body followed. In another study, participants who were exposed to words related to politeness were less likely to interrupt someone. Those primed with words like rude, aggressive, or bother, they interrupted much faster. Same people, different inputs, different outputs. You think you're consistent, but you're not. You're a machine. And your next move depends on what just entered your brain. Even the way you vote can be altered by the room you're in. Researchers found that people who voted in a school building were more likely to support education funding than those who voted elsewhere. The location itself acted as a subconscious cue. Now think about the places you've made decisions. The lighting, the music, the smells, the headlines you read that morning. None of it random. All of it matters. Your brain doesn't reset between actions. It carries traces, impressions, tiny fragments that guide what happens next. Let me give you one more. In another experiment, researchers showed participants a picture of a library right before giving them a memory task. Then they measured how loud the participants spoke. Those primed with the library photo, they spoke more quietly. The prime activated a context. Quiet is expected. No rules, no instructions, just an image and a reaction. It's like planting a whisper in your head. Now let's scale this up. Marketing teams use priming constantly. A word like luxury next to a car ad, suddenly the vehicle seems worth more. Even if nothing changed, a picture of a happy family next to a product, you feel emotionally safer buying it. Colors prime too. Red makes people move faster. Blue slows you down. Green feels natural. Black feels powerful. Fonts prime. Music primes. Even temperature primes. Studies show that holding a warm drink makes people rate strangers as more generous and friendly. Holding a cold drink, they seem colder, harsher. That's how fragile your impressions are. One temperature, one word, one background song. And now the person in front of you feels different, and you'll call it intuition. This is why priming is so dangerous. It feels natural. It feels like your own thought, but it was placed. Now imagine what this means for your emotions. If you're exposed to sad imagery, you'll rate stories as more tragic. You'll judge strangers as more broken. You'll even recall more negative memories. And if you're primed with money-related words, you're more likely to act selfishly in group tasks, less helpful, less generous. Just seeing the word money can make you colder. You're not deciding to be cruel. You're just following the cue. You can be nudged by anything. A news headline, a product label, a scent in the hallway, a single word in a sentence. And most of the time, you'll never trace it back. You'll say, I just had a gut feeling. You had a primed brain. And if someone knows the right cues, they can lead you anywhere. But priming isn't the only silent force. Sometimes it's not even about what you hear, but how it's framed. Two people can be told the exact same fact and walk away with opposite beliefs. One saves a life. The other pulls a trigger. Same data, different frame. And once the frame is set, you'll never see it neutrally again. Framing effect, how context rewrites your preferences. You're told a surgery has a 90% success rate. You feel relieved. You breathe easier. You think, that's pretty safe. Now imagine the exact same surgery. But this time, you're told there's a 10% chance of death. Suddenly, you hesitate. Same numbers, same outcome. Different feeling. That's the framing effect. And it's one of the most disturbing failures of your brain, because it proves your decisions are not about information. They're about how it's wrapped. Your brain is not a logic machine. It's a context interpreter. Change the frame. Change the feeling. Change the choice. Let's go deeper. A famous study asked two groups to evaluate a new medicine. One group heard, this drug helps 70 out of 100 people. The other heard, this drug fails in 30 out of 100 cases. Same statistic, different phrasing, but the first group believed in the drug. The second group distrusted it, just because the number was framed in terms of success versus failure. And now think about how headlines are written. Think about how warnings are worded. Think about how you judge people based on whether they're introduced as a survivor or as someone who almost died. Same story, different shade. You're not processing truth, you're reacting to atmosphere. Here's another example. You're told there are two meat packages in the grocery store. One says 90% lean. The other says 10% fat. Same product, same content. But people overwhelmingly choose the 90% lean one because lean sounds clean. Fat sounds like guilt. It's all framing. And it happens in milliseconds. This is why politicians carefully choose their language. It's why no one wants to call it spying. They call it surveillance. It's not cuts to services. It's fiscal responsibility. It's not killing civilians. It's collateral damage. Each phrase frames the event. It reshapes how you emotionally react without changing a single fact. Even in personal relationships, framing affects everything. I'm not controlling. I just care. I didn't lie. I just didn't want to hurt you. I'm not angry. I'm passionate. People don't change. Their story does. And when someone frames their actions skillfully, you stop seeing them clearly. You start seeing the frame. Now let's flip it. Think about your own identity. How do you describe yourself? I'm not lazy. I'm reflective. I'm not indecisive. I'm thoughtful. I'm not antisocial. I just value solitude. Each one is a reframe, a new lens, a way to soften the edges of truth. This isn't lying. It's survival. Because how things are framed changes how people treat you and how you treat yourself. But this isn't just about language. It even works with visual context. Put a small object next to something massive, and it looks tiny. Put it next to something even smaller, and it looks big. Now apply that to people, to emotions, to morality. A $50 fine feels huge until you're told someone else got $500. Your sadness feels deep until you see someone else grieving harder. Your guilt feels unbearable until someone tells you others have done worse. Your brain recalibrates instantly, not based on values, but on contrast. This is how cultures shift. This is how propaganda spreads. This is how entire societies justify atrocities. Frame your side as the victim. Frame the enemy as a threat. Frame the violence as defense. And suddenly, people cheer. Even murder can be framed as virtue. And once the frame is in place, facts don't matter. People will defend the frame, even against evidence, even against themselves. This is why debates go nowhere. This is why apologies often fail. This is why people cling to bad ideas long after they've been proven false, because the facts were never the problem. The frame was. And changing that frame feels like death, because it means admitting you were seeing the world wrong. But what happens when the frame isn't yours to choose? When someone else picks your default setting and you go along with it, just because it was already selected? You didn't pick the options. You just clicked what was there. No reason, no preference, just what was already filled in. And you told yourself it was a decision, but it wasn't. It was the default. The default bias, why you always pick what's already chosen. You open a form. The checkbox is already filled in. You don't uncheck it. You don't ask why it's there. You don't question what it means. You move on. Congratulations, you just made a decision, or at least it felt like one. This is the default bias, the tendency to accept whatever option is already selected because it's easier, because it feels safe, because it must be there for a reason. But the real reason? Your brain doesn't like effort. And choice takes effort. When an option is pre-selected, your mind assumes someone smarter already made that call. It feels official. It feels correct. And so, you comply. You think it's a preference. It's not. It's a shortcut. Let me show you how far this goes. In countries like Austria and Belgium, organ donation is the default. If you want to opt out, you have to actively say so. In countries like the United States or Germany, it's the opposite. You have to opt in. Same question, same population, but the difference in participation rates, massive. Austria, over 90% are donors. Germany, closer to 12%. Why? Not because Germans are selfish, not because Austrians are saints, because the default was different, and most people just don't change it. This applies to your privacy settings, your software permissions, your retirement plans, your health insurance, your political preferences. You go with whatever's already selected. You let the system decide, and you feel relieved, as if the burden of choice has been lifted. But here's the horror. Who picked that default? Who benefits from it? Because someone set that value. Someone decided what you would probably leave untouched, and you did. You can be nudged into compliance just by making a bad option look like less work to change. And it doesn't stop with paperwork. Think about school. The default is, sit still, don't question. Follow the curriculum, check the boxes. Break that pattern. You're punished, so you stay inside it. Not because it fits you, but because it's already there. And over time, you forget it was ever a choice. You become a product of defaults, even your beliefs. What holidays you celebrate, what words you use, what ideas feel sacred, what kinds of people feel normal. You didn't decide most of this. It was installed. You inherited the menu. You just didn't uncheck the box. This is how entire systems maintain power, not through force, through defaults. Make obedience the starting point. Make silence the expected setting. Make agreement look like the normal option. Then let inertia do the rest. And it will. Because your brain craves ease. Every unexamined belief, every unchanged habit, every policy you scroll past and accept, that's the machinery working. And here's the trap. Once the default has been accepted, it becomes invisible. You don't remember choosing it, so you assume it's just how things are. And when someone else challenges it, you feel attacked, not because the new idea is wrong, but because it demands effort. And effort feels like danger. So you defend the default. You become its guardian, its spokesperson, its unthinking mouthpiece. You forget that it was ever optional. But sometimes, the most powerful manipulations don't even offer a default. They just change the choices themselves. They give you two options, both false, both limited. And you choose between them, feeling like you had a say. It's not about what you picked. It's about what you were allowed to pick from. False choice. How systems trick you into feeling free. You're given two options, Pepsi or Coke, left or right, work or starve. And you choose. You feel the weight of freedom in your chest. You say, at least I had a choice, but you didn't. You had a menu. You didn't write it. You just picked from what was placed in front of you. That's false choice. The illusion of freedom designed to distract you from the fact that real freedom was never on the table. Here's how it works. A child is told, you can either clean your room now or lose your video games for the day. The child picks cleaning. It feels like a decision. But the real option, not cleaning at all, not caring, not agreeing to the whole setup, was never offered. The structure decided the outcome. The freedom was framed. Adults aren't immune. You're told, vote for this candidate or the world ends. Support this policy or you're the problem. You're not allowed to reject the premise. You just pick a side. It feels like autonomy. It's actually design. Let's make it darker. In one psychological experiment, participants were asked to taste two identical jams. Afterward, they were told one was labeled organic and the other wasn't. People picked the organic one as their favorite, even though it was the same. But then something stranger happened. They were asked why they chose it. And they gave detailed reasons: smoother texture, richer taste, more natural sweetness, all imaginary. But their brain filled in the blanks to justify a fake choice, because the feeling of choosing was more important than the reality. Now imagine this at scale. You walk into a store. Hundreds of products, dozens of colors, styles, variations. But every item was made by the same 5 corporations. Every option designed within narrow limits. but it feels infinite, so you don't question it. You say, well, at least I got to choose. You didn't. You just played inside someone else's game. This is how systems maintain control, not by forbidding options, but by shaping which ones are offered. Let's say a company offers two jobs. One is high stress, high pay. The other is low stress, low pay. You choose the one that fits your personality. But the company still wins. You're still inside their wage box, their labor structure, their clock, and you thank them for the opportunity because you chose, or so it seemed. Now apply this to education. You can major in this or that. Pick a path, pick a future, but all the futures lead to debt, to submission, to conformity. You picked your path, but not your framework. And the most disturbing part? You're proud of your choice, because the illusion works best when you feel grateful for it. This is the core of manufactured freedom. It gives you rails. It paints them in your favorite color. Then it lets you decide which direction to ride, not whether to get off the track, not whether to question the machine, just left or right. False choice is everywhere. In customer service menus, in political arguments, in the question, are you a good person or one of them? It's the trap of binaries. This or that, us or them, safe or dangerous, compliant or outcast. And the longer you live in a system like that, the more you lose the ability to imagine outside it. You become fluent in false questions. You stop asking, what aren't they letting me ask? And instead, you answer with confidence, thinking you've exercised judgment. But all you've done is pick your cage. And once you've picked your cage, you begin defending it. Because if you believe you chose it, then it must be right. That's where the next mechanism comes in. A trick so powerful, you'll rewrite your past, your memories, even your personality, just to avoid admitting you made a bad choice. Cognitive dissonance, how you rewire your mind to justify the cage. You've made a choice. Maybe it was the wrong one. You feel it deep down, a quiet discomfort, an itch beneath the logic. But instead of changing your mind, you change your story. That's cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the most powerful rewiring tools your brain has, not to find truth, but to protect your sense of self. Here's how it works. Your mind wants to believe that your thoughts, your actions, and your values are consistent, that you are rational, that you are good, that your choices make sense. But what happens when they don't? When your actions conflict with your identity? When your values clash with your behavior? You don't crumble, you adjust, not by changing the behavior, but by rewriting the belief. Let me show you how this plays out. In a classic experiment, participants were asked to perform a boring, repetitive task, turning pegs on a board for an hour. Afterward, some were paid $20 to lie and say the task was fun. You'd think the people paid more would believe their own lie more deeply, but the opposite happened. Those paid $20 knew they lied for the money, but those paid $1. They had no excuse, so their minds rewrote the experience. They convinced themselves that the task wasn't so bad, that it was actually kind of interesting. Why? Because otherwise they'd have to admit, I just lied, for no reason. And that's uncomfortable. So instead, the mind rewrites the truth to protect the self-image. This is dissonance reduction, and it happens constantly. You say you care about your health, but you eat junk food, so you tell yourself, well, I had a rough day. I deserve it. Or it's just one time. I'll be strict tomorrow. You say you value honesty, but you lie to a friend. So you rationalize. I didn't want to hurt them, or they wouldn't understand the truth anyway. Your mind isn't seeking truth. It's seeking coherence, because psychological tension is a threat to the self, and the self must be preserved. This is why people stay in toxic relationships. Why soldiers commit atrocities and say, I had no choice. Why political supporters double down, even when caught in obvious contradictions. It's easier to believe a lie than to admit you've lived inside one. Because the pain of inconsistency feels like identity fracture, and the brain won't allow that. So it adapts, it justifies, it smooths the conflict. Even if it means building a completely false version of reality. This is how cults work, how mass delusions survive, how entire populations commit horrors and sleep at night. Once you've taken action, you need to believe that action was right. So you build the beliefs to match, even if you didn't start with them. This is the danger of behavior-driven belief. The more you invest, the harder it is to admit you were wrong. You justify staying. You rewrite the past. You say, it wasn't so bad. You say, it was for the greater good. You say, I would have done it anyway. And eventually, you believe it. Because belief follows action, not the other way around. You don't lie because you're dishonest. You become dishonest because you lied. You don't obey because you believe in the rule. You believe in the rule because you obeyed. This is why so many systems don't care if your first step is hesitant. They just need you to start. Say the words. Sign the form. Play along. Because once you act, your mind will finish the job. It will make sure you feel aligned, even if it has to erase your former self to do it. Now think about how many of your beliefs weren't things you reasoned toward, but things you adopted because they matched your past behavior. You volunteered, so now you must be a good person. You voted, so now you must believe in the cause. You fought for it, so now it must be justified. To question it would be to question yourself. And for most people, that's unbearable. So they reframe, they reword, they retell, and they keep living inside the edited version. But the original still lingers. The discomfort, the static, the moment of tension you never fully silenced. Because no matter how many times you repaint the story, the cracks still show through when the light hits at the wrong angle. And the light doesn't have to be truth. It can just be someone else living differently. Someone whose actions don't match your version of the world. Someone whose presence makes you uneasy because they force you to feel that old discomfort again. That's when dissonance becomes defensive, and you lash out. You ridicule. You reject. You protect your reality by attacking theirs. Because if they're right, you might be wrong, and the self can't survive that. So the cage gets repainted again, a little thicker, a little smoother. This is how people get trapped in identities they never consciously chose, and now they'll fight to never escape. The IKEA effect. Why you love the things you suffered for. You struggle with it. It takes longer than it should. The instructions don't make sense. The pieces don't fit. You get frustrated. You almost give up. But eventually, you build the thing. And now, you love it. More than you should. More than it deserves. That's the IKEA effect. The psychological bias where people assign more value to things they helped create, especially if the process was difficult. It's not rational. The product might be crooked. The drawer might stick. But to you, it matters more. Because you suffered for it. And this applies far beyond furniture. It explains why we cling to our creations, why we stay loyal to our systems, why we protect the things we bled for even when they're broken. Especially when they're broken. The more effort we invest, the more value we assign. Let me show you how deep this goes. In a study by Michael Norton and colleagues, participants were asked to assemble IKEA furniture, then rate its value. Those who built it themselves rated it significantly higher than identical, pre-assembled versions. Their labor had inflated its worth. This isn't about quality. It's about ownership through struggle. Because when you suffer to build something, it becomes part of you. It doesn't matter if it's ugly. It doesn't matter if someone else did it better. You made it, so your brain defends it. Now let's apply that to beliefs. You spent years defending your ideology. You've written about it, argued for it, sacrificed relationships over it. Now someone shows you evidence that it's flawed. What do? You defend it harder. Not because it's true, because it's yours, because you suffered to build it. and suffering feels like proof. This is why people stay in bad marriages, why they protect toxic jobs, why they cling to failed investments, why they can't admit their startup idea isn't working, because giving up feels like saying, none of it was worth it. And your brain can't allow that. So instead, it invents value. You say, it made me stronger. I learned something. At least I tried. Maybe that's true. Maybe not. But the deeper truth is this: you're defending your pain because you paid for that outcome with time, identity, and suffering. So now, you love it more, even if it hurts you, even if it keeps you trapped. This is how systems weaponize the IKEA effect. They make you work for what others get freely. They make you jump through hoops. They delay gratification. They make the process painful, and when you finally get the reward, you cherish it because you earned it. Even if it's worthless, even if the reward was fake all along. This happens in academia, in hazing rituals, in corporate ladders, in religious devotion. You suffer, so you believe it must matter, because if it didn't, then what was all that pain for? And that's the scariest thought of all. That maybe your suffering wasn't noble, wasn't meaningful, wasn't justified, just wasted. So your mind invents meaning. It inflates the outcome. It tells a new story. You say, that job built character. That relationship taught me love. That system works, you just have to try harder. But sometimes, the job was just exploitation. The relationship was just damage. The system was just abuse. And what you built was just a coping mechanism. The IKEA effect is emotional sunk cost. It binds you to things you struggled with, not because they're good, but because they were hard. And humans have a terrible habit of confusing difficulty with value. If it hurt, it must have mattered. If it was painful, it must be important. And so, we fall in love with our own suffering. We wear it like a badge. We turn it into a foundation. We say, this is who I am, and we defend it, even if it breaks us. But what if the belief isn't yours at all? What if the thoughts you built your identity around were placed there by something else? Not by suffering, not by choice, but by simple repetition, over and over, until you believed it. Because when something repeats often enough, your brain stops questioning and starts agreeing. The illusion of truth. Why repetition makes lies feel real. You hear it once. It sounds wrong. You hesitate. You hear it twice. It still feels off, but not as much. By the third or fourth time, it starts to sound familiar. And then one day, you find yourself saying it, believing it, defending it, not because it became true, but because it became repeated. This is the illusion of truth effect, the disturbing tendency for your brain to believe something is true, simply because it's been heard before, not because it's logical, not because it's proven, because it's familiar. Let me show you the science. In one study, participants were shown trivia statements. Some were true, some false. Later, the false ones were repeated, and suddenly, people began rating them as more likely to be accurate. Even when they already knew they were false, just hearing them again softened the disbelief, because repetition makes the brain comfortable, and comfort often gets mistaken for truth. Your mind is built for patterns, not for accuracy. It assumes that if something shows up often, it must be important. If it's familiar, it must be safe. And if you've heard it before, you stop checking. You say, yeah, that sounds about right, even if it's wrong. This is how propaganda works. Not through evidence, through volume. Repeat a phrase. Everywhere. In articles, conversations, headlines, memes. Soon it becomes unchallenged. Then unnoticeable. Then sacred. Like background noise. You forgot to question. And once a lie becomes familiar, challenging it feels strange. It feels confrontational. It feels disrespectful. Because repetition doesn't just create belief, it creates norms. And once something becomes normal, Your brain wants to protect it. Think about advertising. You don't buy the product the first time you see it, but after the 50th time, it's in your head. It feels known. It feels legitimate. So you pick it, not because it's better, because it's repeated. This applies to news, to slogans, to social values, to conspiracy theories. A dangerous claim can be wrapped in so much familiarity that it stops setting off alarms. And the repetition isn't always loud. It can be subtle. The same framing, the same narrative, the same emotional tone, woven into different stories. You don't hear it directly. You absorb it, and over time it becomes your worldview. And the most dangerous part, you won't remember where it came from. That's the illusion. You think your beliefs formed through thought, but many of them were installed through repetition. Over years, in school, on television, in casual phrases, in jokes. This is how cultures build prejudice, how generations inherit fear, how lies become legacy. You say, that's just how things are. But is it? Or is that just what you've always heard? Now consider this. The brain uses fluency as a shortcut for truth. If a sentence is easier to read, you're more likely to believe it. If the font is clean, if the voice is confident, if the pacing is smooth, it feels true, even when it isn't, even when it's dangerous. This is why charismatic speakers can make wild claims feel obvious, why a simple repeated lie will outperform a complicated truth, because truth doesn't go viral, but familiarity does. And once that repetition builds a worldview, your mind will filter reality to match it. You'll seek out information that reinforces it. You'll avoid anything that challenges it. You'll surround yourself with people who agree, not because you're narrow-minded, but because disagreement feels wrong, because the lie has lived in you for too long, and now it's part of you. And this is where it gets even darker. Because if a false belief becomes part of your identity, you'll protect it at all costs. You'll fight for it. You'll argue for it. You'll burn bridges over it. Even if part of you suspects it was never real, even if the only reason you believed it was because someone said it over and over and over again. But repetition alone isn't the only lever. There's something even subtler, something your brain can't resist, a psychological itch you feel. Every time a question is asked, it's the power of framing, not what you're told, but how it's told. Because even the structure of a question can lead you to the wrong answer and make you believe it was your own idea. Anchoring, how your first thought controls the next 100. You see a number, $500. It's the first thing on the screen. Then you see the real price, $200. Suddenly, it feels like a bargain. But is it? That's the power of anchoring. A mental glitch that locks your brain to the first piece of information it sees, even if it's random, even if it's fake, because once the anchor is set, everything after it gets compared to that reference point. Not reality, just the first number. It's why $200 feels cheap after $500. It's why a sale is more persuasive than a fair price. And it's why your brain, for all its logic, still falls for this trick every single day. Let me show you how easily it happens. In one experiment, participants were asked to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number. Then they were shown items, wine, chocolate, computer equipment, and asked how much they'd pay. The results? People with higher digits were willing to pay more for everything, even though the number was completely unrelated. Because that number, the one they just wrote down, became their anchor, and it pulled every judgment toward it. That's how fragile your decisions are. One meaningless number can distort your sense of value, risk, fairness, truth. Anchoring doesn't just affect prices, it affects everything. Ask someone, do you think Gandhi was over 144 years old when he died? They laugh. Of course not. But now ask them to guess his age. They'll guess higher than people who weren't shown the first question, just seeing a high number. nudges their estimate upward. And they'll swear it didn't affect them. But it did. You are more influenced by the first thing you hear than you'd ever admit. The first sentence in a debate, the first accusation, the first statistic in a news story, it becomes the lens, the gravitational pull, and your brain keeps adjusting around it like it's the center of the map, even when it's wrong, even when it was planted. This is why propaganda often starts with big numbers. Millions believe this, thousands of cases, billions lost. You don't question the anchor. You just compare against it. It's why first impressions matter so much, because your brain doesn't start neutral. It starts anchored, and after that, everything becomes relative, not objective, not measured, just compared to what came first. Now think about how this shapes identity. You're told early on, you're smart, you're lazy, you're dramatic, you're not a math person. And now, for the rest of your life, every action is interpreted through that original anchor, even if it's false. Even if you changed, anchoring doesn't care. It locks on, and it holds. This happens in relationships too. You meet someone on a good day. They're funny, warm, generous. They make a bad decision later. You give them grace. But if you met them on a bad day, they were cold, distracted, rude. Every good action afterward feels suspicious because it doesn't match the anchor. Your brain isn't updating, it's correcting, trying to force new information to fit the original mold. This is why first impressions are so hard to undo and why first thoughts shape entire worldviews. If your introduction to a concept came from fear, you'll carry that fear even when new facts arrive. If the first time you heard about a person was through scandal, you'll keep that flavor, even if it's disproven, because you're not thinking in facts. You're thinking in anchors, and anchors sink deep. Now imagine how systems use this. A politician proposes an extreme policy. Everyone panics. Then they suggest something slightly less extreme. Now it feels reasonable. Not because it is, but because the anchor was worse, or in business, you're offered a premium product at a ridiculous price. Now the mid-tier version feels like a smart deal. Same strategy. Set the anchor high, then anything below it feels acceptable. You're not choosing what's best. You're choosing what feels better by comparison. And you don't even realize you were never deciding freely. You were reacting. Because once the anchor is planted, everything else is just gravity. The spotlight effect. Why you think everyone's watching you. You trip over your own foot. You spill your drink. You say the wrong word in a meeting, and immediately you feel it. That hot wave of shame. That sinking feeling in your chest. Everyone saw. Everyone noticed. Everyone is thinking about you now. But they're not. You are experiencing the spotlight effect, your brain's tendency to vastly overestimate how much attention other people are paying to you. In your mind, the spotlight is bright, centered, and merciless. But in reality, you're just part of the background. Because most people are too busy thinking about themselves to be focused on you, but your brain doesn't know that because you live inside it. So every mistake feels huge. Every awkward moment feels public. Every stumble feels like a collapse in reputation. And so you shrink, you hide, you rehearse every sentence before speaking. You edit your personality down to something smaller, safer, forgettable. But not because anyone's watching, because you think they are. Let's go deeper. In a classic study, researchers asked participants to wear an embarrassing t-shirt featuring a celebrity they didn't like into a room full of strangers. Afterward, the participants were asked, "How many people noticed your shirt?" Their guesses were double the actual number. They believed they'd been seen, judged, remembered. But most people didn't even look. They were focused on themselves. That's the spotlight effect. It creates a false reality, where you are always the center of someone else's story. And it's exhausting, because it makes you self-monitor constantly. It makes you afraid to be spontaneous. It makes you think that a small, awkward moment is a lasting stain. But it isn't. People forget much faster than you think because they're too busy worrying about how they're being seen to remember how you looked. This is why you replay things in your head that no one else even noticed. The nervous laugh, the wrong tone, the mispronounced word. You build entire shame narratives around events no one cared about, because to you, they happened under the spotlight. But to everyone else, they were background noise. And this illusion has a cost. It makes you risk-averse. It makes you cautious. It makes you invisible. You don't try new things, not because you aren't curious, but because you're afraid of looking stupid. You don't speak up, not because you don't have thoughts, but because you imagine the spotlight burning too hot. You don't ask the question. You don't tell the truth. You don't show up fully. And the tragedy is, no one was even watching, and if they were, they probably forgot by lunch. Now imagine what this does over time. You start designing your life around an imaginary audience. You curate your personality. You censor your emotions. You filter your behavior through a lens that doesn't even exist. You live not to be judged by people who were never paying attention. And in doing so, you become a performance, a character, a version of yourself, built to avoid humiliation. But that version isn't alive. It's a defense mechanism. And every day you stay in character, you reinforce the belief that who you really are is too embarrassing to be seen. That's the real damage of the spotlight effect. It doesn't just make you feel watched, it makes you hide, not because the world is hostile, but because you imagine it is. And you might go your entire life believing you were under scrutiny, when really, you were just in a room full of people, too busy trying to survive their own performance. And here's the twist. When you see someone else trip, you forget it in 5 seconds. But when you trip, you replay it for 5 years. You extend to others the grace you never give yourself. You forgive their stumbles. You ignore their awkwardness. You let them exist, but you won't let yourself. And that's the trap. You are a prisoner of your own projection. Not their judgment, just your imagined version of it. But what happens when you turn that spotlight inward? When your entire sense of self becomes a narrative? Something to edit, explain, defend? When your identity isn't something you live, but something you tell. Narrative identity. You're not a person, you're a story. You already started telling it. After the mistake, after the silence, after the spotlight dimmed, you told yourself why it happened. You built a frame, a reason, a version of events. You told a story, not just about what happened, but about who you are. This is narrative identity, the quiet belief that you are the story you tell about yourself, not your DNA, not your neurons, not your raw experience, but the explanation you wrapped around it. That's what you call you. It sounds poetic, but it's dangerous because stories can lie, and once they lie convincingly enough, you live inside them. You say, I'm the kind of person who pushes through. I've always been bad at relationships. I'm just not good at math. I'm the black sheep. I'm resilient. I'm broken. And you repeat it. Over years, in therapy, in conversations, in quiet thoughts you never speak out loud. And each repetition turns fiction into framework, because your brain loves coherence. It would rather have a wrong story than none at all. Let me show you how deeply this runs. People with amnesia, whose memory has been wiped, can still maintain a sense of identity. I'm the kind of person who loves nature. I'm stubborn. I've always been independent, even when they've forgotten why they believe that, even when they've lost the memories that justified it. Because identity isn't memory, it's narrative. It's the connective tissue, the through line, the interpretation, and it's selective. You edit out the things that don't match. You forget the moments that contradict the theme. You highlight what fits. You cut what doesn't, like a bad screenwriter protecting their plot. You don't record your life. You rewrite it. And here's where it gets eerie. Two people can live the same experience, but walk away with opposite identities. One says, that trauma made me stronger. The other says, that trauma ruined my life. Same event, different author. Because narrative identity isn't about truth, it's about meaning, and meaning is malleable. This is how heroes are built, how villains are created, how victims become saviors, and how some people never recover because they told themselves they weren't allowed to. This is why someone can be successful and still feel like a failure, or be loved and still feel alone, because their story doesn't include joy. Their plot isn't written for healing, and the longer it goes unchallenged, the deeper it roots. The past becomes fixed. The character becomes rigid. The script becomes prophecy. You stop living. You start performing the next chapter. You become loyal to a version of yourself that no longer exists, because that version gives you structure, even if it limits you, even if it hurts. Some people would rather be the tragic character they understand than the free person they don't recognize. You've seen it. The person who says, I'm just this way. The person who sabotages joy because it doesn't fit the arc. The person who turns every compliment into discomfort. Because the script doesn't allow for growth. The character isn't written for redemption. And the real horror, you wrote it, you narrated it, over years, until it hardened. And now, you protect it. Not because it's true, because without it, you're unstructured, unstable, undefined. So you cling to the story, even when it's outdated, even when it's cruel, even when you know it's keeping you small. But what happens? When the story begins to crumble, when someone shows you a different plot, one where your failures weren't flaws, just adaptations, do you rewrite it? Or do you push them away to protect the version you've memorized? Because changing the story means confronting the gap, the space between who you were and who you might have been, if the story had been different. And that gap is unbearable. So you stay loyal to the myth and call it identity. But that myth isn't stable. It's built on choices, interpretations, emotional logic disguised as fact. And when your identity is under pressure, when your ego is threatened, when your self-image is cracked, you start bending logic to protect it. You start lying to yourself without even knowing. Self-serving bias, how you lie to yourself without knowing. In the year 1212, a French teenager named Stephen of Cloyes claimed he had been visited by Jesus Christ himself. The message. He was chosen to lead a holy army of children, thousands of them, across Europe to peacefully convert Muslims in the Holy Land. Within weeks, the so-called Children's Crusade was underway. No adult commanders, no food supplies, just thousands of children walking toward death with conviction in their hearts. Most of them died. Some were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Others simply vanished in the Alps. And yet, when the few survivors returned, do you think the adults who supported it, who watched the children leave, stood up and said, "We were wrong"? They didn't. Instead, they said the children must not have been pure enough, or that God must have had a different plan, or that the sins of others had tainted the mission. Because to admit the truth that they had endorsed a mass delusion, allowed children to walk into tragedy, and did so in the name of righteousness, would be unbearable, so they rewrote the story. That's self-serving bias. And it's not just about ego, it's about survival. When the mind is confronted with the possibility that you were wrong, you caused harm, or you weren't the person you claimed to be, it does something quietly brutal. It lies to protect you from yourself. This bias doesn't just operate in religious myths or historical events. It lives in your daily life. Right now, let's say you fail a job interview. What's easier to say, "I wasn't prepared," or "the company was biased"? You fight with a partner. Do you reflect on how you escalated it, or do you focus on how they triggered you? You didn't pick the slow checkout line. The universe targeted you. You didn't miss the deadline. Your boss didn't communicate clearly. You didn't lose the argument. The other person was just emotional. We rarely say, I made a bad decision, or I was careless, or I was wrong. Why? Because those admissions threaten the foundation of who we think we are. And the more central something is to your identity, being smart, being kind, being competent, the more violently your brain will defend it. Psychologists have tested this. In one study, students were given a difficult logic test. Afterward, they received fake scores. Some were told they did well. Others were told they failed, regardless of how they actually performed. Then they were asked to reflect on the outcome. Those who were told they passed credited their intelligence, work ethic, or natural ability. Those told they failed blamed the test, the room temperature, even the researchers themselves. They lied, not intentionally, but reflexively, because the self-image had to be preserved. Now think about how dangerous this becomes at scale. A political leader starts a war. The justification turns out to be false. The mission becomes a disaster. But admitting that would mean admitting that lives were wasted, that people died for nothing, that power was abused. So instead of facing it, the goal is reframed. It wasn't about weapons. It was about spreading freedom. It wasn't about oil. It was about democracy. It wasn't a failure. It was a necessary sacrifice. The story changes, so the ego of the system stays intact. You've seen it on a smaller scale too. A friend who constantly ruins relationships, but always blames their partners. A coworker who misses deadlines, but always has a reason outside their control. The student who never studies, then says the test was unfair. The pattern is always the same. Success is internal. I did this. I earned it. I'm good. Failure is external. They sabotaged me. It wasn't my fault. The system's broken, and we all do it. Constantly, subconsciously, not because we're selfish, but because we need to believe we're stable, that we're good people, that our lives make sense, that the person in the mirror is still who we thought they were. But sometimes, that's just not true. Sometimes you were the villain. Sometimes you really did cause harm. Sometimes it was your fault. And unless you're willing to face that, you'll stay locked inside the flattering illusion. Even worse, you'll stop growing. Because if every mistake was someone else's fault, you never learn. You just keep defending the past. And it doesn't end at the personal level. It scales into group behavior. Tribes, nations, religions. Every mass atrocity in history came with a story, a righteous story, a flattering one. We were protecting our people. We were cleansing corruption. We were obeying God. Very few said, we committed evil, we chose fear, we lied to ourselves. Because the greater the sin, the stronger the defense. And the harder it is to escape. Self-serving bias is not about confidence. It's about avoiding the terrifying truth that you are capable of being wrong, deeply, tragically wrong. And that truth is so threatening that most people will spend their entire lives rewriting reality to protect themselves from it. But sometimes, the lies go deeper, not just in your conclusions, but in your logic itself. Because even when you think you're being rational, even when you're assembling arguments and citing evidence, even when you swear you're just following reason, what you're actually doing is bending logic to defend your feelings. Motivated reasoning, when emotions pretend to be logic. Let me ask you something. Have you ever argued with someone, and halfway through, you realize they're wrong, but you keep going anyway? Not because you care about the truth anymore, but because backing down would feel humiliating. You tell yourself you're being logical. You cite statistics, stories, examples. But the truth is, you're not trying to find the answer. You're trying to win. That's motivated reasoning. It's when your brain uses logic not to discover the truth, but to protect something more precious, your feelings. Let me give you a historical example. In 1988, a young mother named Jenny McCarthy had a son diagnosed with autism. In her grief, confusion, and helplessness, she found a scapegoat: vaccines. She wasn't alone. A now discredited paper had already made headlines linking vaccines to autism, a study based on falsified data, funded by lawyers preparing a lawsuit. The science was wrong. The paper was retracted. The author was banned from practicing medicine, but the damage was done. Why? Because people weren't evaluating evidence. They were motivated to believe something. Parents needed an explanation, a villain, a reason why their child had suffered, and the more emotional the topic, the harder the bias clings. Motivated reasoning hijacks your logic circuits. It doesn't block evidence, it twists it. If the facts support your emotions, you embrace them. If they don't, you question the source, the method, the motivation behind the research. You don't say, "That's inconvenient." You say, "That's biased," and you feel proud for seeing through it. This doesn't just apply to fringe movements. It affects you right now. Let's say you believe you're a good person. You hurt someone, but you don't want to think of yourself as cruel. So instead of admitting you were careless, you reinterpret the event. They overreacted. You were misunderstood. You were just being honest. They're too sensitive. Your logic didn't discover that. It protected you. Let's take another example. Imagine someone who believes a particular politician is morally upright. That politician gets caught in a scandal, money laundering, corruption, abuse. Do they say, "Wow, I was wrong"? Usually not. They say, "This is fake news." They're being framed. Everyone else does it too. They cherry-pick articles. They listen to podcasts that reinforce their belief. They cling to one expert who says what they want to hear and ignore the 99 who don't, because it's not about evidence, it's about comfort. And here's the terrifying part: your brain rewards you for this. When you successfully defend a belief you're emotionally attached to, you get a dopamine hit. It feels like you've just won a chess match, like you've been clever, like you've out-reasoned the world. But all you've done is build a more elegant lie. This is why smart people aren't immune to bias. They're better at justifying it. The more intelligent you are, the more skilled your brain becomes at constructing elaborate, rational-sounding defenses for beliefs you never truly questioned. You're not using logic to discover, you're using it to defend. Here's a visual metaphor. Imagine your belief is a castle, and reason is supposed to be the architect, building structures based on what makes sense. But with motivated reasoning, reason becomes a defense contractor. It's not designing truth. It's building walls, archers, moats, to protect something that might not deserve to be protected at all. It's how cult members maintain belief, even after prophecies fail. It's how people stay loyal to abusers. It's how entire societies justify oppression by dressing it up in moral language, selective memory, and convenient data. Let's bring it closer to home. You've probably known someone, maybe it's you, who stayed in a bad relationship too long. Friends pointed out red flags. You ignored them. Instead, you focused on every small moment of affection, every "at least he's trying," every justification that made it okay to stay. Because leaving meant admitting you were wrong about them, that you wasted years, that you ignored your own needs. So your brain went to work, not to save you, but to save your belief. Motivated reasoning is why people believe the earth is flat, why cults drink poison, why gamblers swear the next spin is due. It's not stupidity. It's emotional investment. And the deeper the emotion, the more elaborate the defense. Because what you believe is not a cold calculation. It's part of who you are. And when that belief is threatened, it feels like you are. So you go to war, not with logic, but with logic-shaped weapons. And the worst part? You'll walk away, feeling like you were right all along. Learned helplessness. When you stop trying because it once didn't work, so you've bent your logic to protect your beliefs. You've defended a failing relationship, a bad decision, a false truth. You've built your walls. You've kept your story alive. But what happens when even your own defenses don't work anymore? When you keep trying and failing so many times that something inside you quietly gives up? Not loudly, not in a dramatic breakdown. Just a slow, quiet resignation. This is learned helplessness, and it might be the most invisible prison your mind can build. Let me tell you a story. It's not a happy one. In the 1960s, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran a series of now infamous experiments with dogs. The dogs were placed in a harness and given electric shocks. Some had a lever they could press with their nose to stop the pain. Others had no control, no way out. Eventually, they were all placed in a new environment, a box with a low wall they could easily jump over to escape future shocks. The dogs who had control before, they escaped immediately. But the ones who had learned there was no way out, they didn't even try. They just lay down and whimpered, accepting pain they could now avoid, because their brain had been rewired by failure. They weren't helpless, they just believed they were. Now replace the dog with a person, a student who keeps failing tests until they stop studying altogether, a woman in an abusive relationship who stops calling for help because no one listened the first time, a worker passed over for promotion so many times he stops applying. They all say the same thing in different words. What's the point? It's not laziness. It's not weakness. It's a learned response to a world that told them, no matter what you do, it won't matter. The danger of learned helplessness isn't that it feels painful, it's that it stops feeling anything. It dulls you. It teaches you to accept things you should resist. It teaches you to stay in places you could leave. You start surrendering small parts of your life, opportunities, goals, relationships, not because you've chosen peace, but because you've forgotten that effort can lead to change. Let me give you a more modern example. In some parts of the world, generations grow up in poverty, not just economically, but psychologically. Children are born into environments where every attempt at change is met with bureaucratic failure, social stigma, or systemic blocks. By the time they're adults, they don't just feel disadvantaged, they feel doomed, so they stop trying. Not because they're incapable, because they've been trained to associate effort with futility. It's not just trauma, it's conditioning. Now consider this. People in abusive relationships often report that the worst part wasn't the violence, but the hopelessness, the belief that leaving wouldn't help, that telling someone would make it worse, that there was no better to reach for. So they stayed, they complied, they minimized, because after enough failed exits, even the cage starts to feel like home. Learned helplessness is the quiet internalization of "it doesn't matter," and once it settles in, you start seeing it everywhere. In the way people stop voting, in the way they tolerate injustice, in the way they stay quiet when they should speak, in the way they accept being treated like they're small because something long ago convinced them they are. It's not that people want to suffer, it's that they've stopped believing suffering can be avoided. And the irony, the more they stay passive, the more the world confirms their belief. The longer the dog lies still, the more the shocks keep coming, and the harder it becomes to stand up and test the wall again. But here's the terrifying part. Fear. Systems exploit this. A government that doesn't fix poverty, but normalizes it. A company that keeps its workers just exhausted enough to stay compliant. A school that punishes curiosity and rewards silence. Because a population that's learned to feel powerless is easier to control than one that still believes in possibility. Helplessness becomes stability, a kind of enforced peace. People stay in line, not because they agree, but because they've been trained to think resistance is pointless. And sometimes they pass that belief on to their children without saying a word. But helplessness doesn't just affect your actions, it starts to shape your identity. If you fail enough times, you don't just say, "I can't succeed." You say, "I'm the kind of person who always fails." And that identity, it starts guiding every future choice. But here's the paradox. Sometimes the trap wasn't real. Sometimes the wall was low. Sometimes all it would have taken was one more try. But your brain never let you find out. Authority bias. Why you obey lab coats. You're in a room. A calm voice tells you to press a button. You do it. A second later, you hear a scream. Someone in another room begging you to stop. The voice tells you to continue. So you do. Another scream. Another cry for help. Another command. And you press the button again. This isn't fiction. This happened hundreds of times. It was 1961. A psychologist named Stanley Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people like you, could commit atrocities under orders. This was just after World War II. The trials at Nuremberg were fresh, and the world was asking a terrifying question. How could so many people obey and participate in such evil? Milgram created an experiment. Participants were told they were helping with a memory study. They were seated in front of a shock generator with switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, mild to deadly. On the other side of the wall, an actor pretending to be shocked. But the participant didn't know that. They believed they were delivering real pain to a real person, because a man in a white lab coat told them it was okay. No threats, no violence, just authority. And here's the disturbing result. 165% of participants continued to deliver shocks all the way up to 450 volts, even after the victim screamed, begged, and went silent. Why? Because the man in the lab coat said, "Please continue." The experiment requires it. It is absolutely essential that you go on. No yelling, no violence, just calm authority. And it was enough to override their morality. That's authority bias, the psychological tendency to believe and obey people who appear to be in positions of power even when they're wrong, even when they're dangerous. We're wired to defer to perceived experts, leaders, uniforms, titles, badges, and white coats. Why? Because from an evolutionary standpoint, it helped us survive. In early human societies, listening to elders and following leaders kept the tribe coordinated. Order meant survival. But now, that same instinct can be exploited. Let's look at history. In Nazi Germany, doctors conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, freezing limbs, injecting poisons, performing surgeries without anesthesia. These weren't sadistic criminals. They were physicians, trained in medicine, respected by peers, and they swore they were doing science, because authority protected them and made their actions feel legitimate. When asked why they participated, many said the same thing: "I was just following orders, not out of fear, but out of belief." Authority didn't just command obedience, it created righteousness. This happens in hospitals. A nurse hesitates to question a doctor's misdiagnosis, even when the patient is dying, because the doctor must know better. It happens in police forces. Officers obey flawed commands because the chain of command must be respected. It happens in religion. People follow destructive teachings because the man in the robe says it's God's will. It happens in science. One flawed study, once cited by enough experts, becomes gospel. It happens in parenting. Children believe their parents' cruelty is love because they've never known anything else, and the parent is the authority. You're probably thinking, "I wouldn't do that. I'd push back." But the truth, you wouldn't. Most people don't. Because authority doesn't just ask, it shapes your sense of reality. If the expert says it's true, it must be. If the boss says it's urgent, it must be. If the system says it's fair, who are you to question? Even the smallest symbols can trigger the bias. A clipboard, a name tag, a confident tone. Studies show that people are more likely to accept advice or instructions if the person is wearing a lab coat, even if they're just an actor. A fake doctor has more psychological power than a real one dressed casually. Think about that. Your brain isn't evaluating truth, it's evaluating presentation. And once the performance is convincing enough, it becomes truth. Authority bias is why people trust news anchors, follow influencers, accept courtroom rulings, and obey unjust laws. It's not just about fear. It's about trust. Conditioned trust. Trust that was planted in childhood and never questioned. We were taught, respect your elders, trust the experts, obey the law. But sometimes the elder is wrong. The expert is corrupt. The law is unjust. And still we follow. Because questioning authority feels like questioning the structure of reality. And your brain doesn't like that kind of chaos. So it defers. And you call it respect. You call it discipline. You call it responsibility. But sometimes it's just obedience in disguise. Social proof. Why the crowd becomes your compass. So maybe you don't trust the lab coat. Maybe you've learned to question the expert. You don't follow orders blindly anymore. But here's the twist. You still follow the crowd. Even if you think you're independent, this is social proof, the psychological phenomenon where people assume the actions of others reflect the correct behavior, especially in situations of uncertainty. It's the unspoken rule inside your brain. If everyone else is doing it, it must be right. Let's start with a simple example. You walk into a restaurant you've never seen before. One side is empty. The other side has a long line out the door. Where do you go? Most people join the line, not because they've read the menu, not because they've tasted the food, but because the presence of a crowd feels like a review. That's social proof. It's why laugh tracks exist in sitcoms. You hear laughter, so you assume it must be funny, even when it's not. It's why people check reviews before buying anything. If a product has thousands of 5-star ratings, you'll trust it more than one with 10, even if you've never read a single review. Because the number is the proof, not the content. This isn't just about products, it's about morality. In the 1960s, researchers staged an experiment. A man collapsed on a busy street. Dozens of people walked by. No one stopped. Why? Because no one else was stopping. And each passerby thought, if no one's helping, maybe he doesn't need help. Or worse, if I stop, I'll stand out. This is called the bystander effect, and it's powered by social proof. If the group does nothing, you assume doing nothing is correct, even if someone is dying in front of you. Let's take it further. In 1978, more than 900 people died in the jungle of Guyana, the Jonestown Massacre. Led by a charismatic leader named Jim Jones. When the order came to drink poison, many hesitated at first. But once a few people took the cup, the rest followed. Mothers gave it to their children. Friends passed it down the line. Some even smiled through tears. Not because they wanted to die, but because everyone else was doing it. And that somehow made it feel right. That's the horror of social proof. It doesn't just shape your choices, it shapes your reality. If the group believes something, you're more likely to believe it too, even if it contradicts your senses. There's a famous study. A group of participants are shown lines of different lengths. The answer is obvious. One line is clearly longer, but everyone else, secretly actors, gives the wrong answer. When it's your turn, most people give the same wrong answer, just to conform. Not because they're unsure, because they don't want to be the only one who's wrong. Your brain is built for survival, and survival in social groups means not being cast out. So even when you know better, you often stay silent. You nod, you mimic, you adjust your voice, your laugh, your opinions, because being normal feels safer than being right. This explains trends. Why people wear the same clothes. Why memes spread. Why slang changes overnight. Why a political idea that was unthinkable a decade ago is now mainstream. Not because it's true, because it was repeated, shared, normalized, and the more people adopt it, the more real it becomes. Social proof can override logic, memory, instinct. It's why cults grow, why genocides happen, why entire societies agree to look away, because the crowd looked away. So you did too. Now let's bring it closer. Ever laughed at a joke you didn't understand? Ever agreed with someone just because others did? Ever held back a question because you didn't want to seem stupid? That wasn't your reasoning, that was social proof. Your compass wasn't pointing north, it was pointing at the crowd. And here's the dark part. Social proof works better when you're uncertain. The more confused, anxious, or out of place you feel, the more your brain craves a signal from others. You look around, you see how others behave, and you sync to them like software to a server, not because they're right, because they're there. That's why marketers show you bestsellers, why influencers post screenshots of follower counts, why movements rely on mass gatherings and marches, because numbers convince. And once enough people believe, the rest follow, even when it's a lie, even when it's evil, even when they would never have believed it alone. But what happens when your first yes leads to another, then another, until suddenly you're deeper than you ever meant to go? You didn't plan to agree. You just didn't say no. And now you can't stop. Foot in the door. How small agreements trap you. You're walking through your neighborhood when a stranger asks you for a favor. Would you mind signing this petition to support safer school zones? It seems harmless. You agree. A week later, the same group returns, this time asking you to place a sign in your yard. It's larger than you expected, an eyesore. But you remember signing the petition. You remember agreeing. And now, saying no feels inconsistent, almost dishonest. So you say yes. That's the foot in the door technique, a psychological strategy where a small initial request makes you more likely to comply with a much larger one later. It's one of the most quietly manipulative tools in persuasion psychology, and it works, because once you've said yes, even to something tiny, your brain begins rewriting your identity to match that decision. You don't just say, I signed a petition. You say, I'm the kind of person who supports this cause. And now, any future request that fits that story feels like something you should agree to. This principle has been demonstrated in dozens of studies. The original experiment in the 1960s asked homeowners to put up a massive, ugly billboard in their front yard. Most said no, but when researchers first asked a smaller favor, like signing a petition or putting up a small window sticker, compliance with the larger request jumped by more than 400%. It's not about pressure, it's about consistency. You say yes to something small, then your identity shifts to match the action, and you keep saying yes to stay psychologically aligned. Now let's make it darker. This is how manipulation works. Not all at once, but incrementally. No one joins a cult on day one. They come to a free seminar. They read a book. They try a breathing exercise. Just small things. Then they're asked to attend a retreat, then to donate, then to cut off family. By the time the request becomes disturbing, they've already said yes so many times. That saying no would tear apart the story of who they've become, and so they stay. The trap was never the final demand. It was the first yes. You can see this in history. During the 1930s, the Nazi regime didn't begin with mass extermination. They started with small laws, curfews, registration, economic restrictions. At each step, people complied. Not because they agreed with genocide, but because the previous step was justified. I already went along with that. This next thing isn't that different. By the time it reached horror, they had either rationalized it or were too far in to turn around, because each yes pulled them deeper, and to stop now would mean admitting that every yes before it was a mistake. So they didn't stop, they escalated. That's the hidden cruelty of the foot in the door effect. The bigger danger isn't the request. It's your desire to feel consistent. Let's say you buy an overpriced product. You feel regret. But instead of returning it, you convince yourself it was a great choice. You say, it's an investment. It'll last longer. I deserved it. You've committed, and now your brain defends the commitment. This shows up in relationships too. You ignore the first red flag. You excuse the second, you justify the third. Each time you're building a case for staying, not because you're blind, but because leaving now would force you to admit you should have left earlier. So you keep saying yes, not because it feels right, but because it hurts less than rewriting your history. This is also how political radicalization works. No one jumps to an extreme belief in a day. They start by following a certain account, reading certain headlines, agreeing with one out-of-context quote. Then they repost something. Then they justify something. Then they defend something they never would have accepted 6 months earlier. But now, it fits the story, because they said yes, over and over. Each time smaller than the last. Each time easier to rationalize. Until the story hardens, and now to say no would feel like betrayal, not of the movement, but of themselves. So the next time someone asks you for something small, pause. Not because the request is dangerous, but because of what it might lead to. Not because you'll be manipulated immediately, but because saying yes today might become part of a story you never meant to write. Scarcity effect. Why you want what you can't have. You've been told the item is almost sold out. Only 2 left in stock. Limited edition. Time's running out. Suddenly, you want it more. Not because the product changed. Not because you need it. But because now it might disappear. This is the scarcity effect. Your brain's irrational desire to assign more value to things that are rare, restricted, or slipping away. You don't want it because it's good. You want it because it's leaving. Let's begin with a classic experiment. In 1975, researchers gave participants a cookie. In one version, the cookie came from a jar full of identical cookies. In the other, the jar held just 2. Same cookie, same taste. But people consistently rated the cookie from the nearly empty jar as more desirable, more delicious, and more valuable. Why? Because scarcity hijacked their judgment. The logic is ancient. If something is hard to get, it must be worth having. In survival environments, that instinct made sense. Water in a drought, shelter in winter, food in a famine, rarity value. That's what your biology believes. But today, that instinct is being used against you. You see it in marketing. Only 3 left. Offer ends tonight. Act now. It's artificial urgency. Engineered anxiety. Your rational mind says, I don't need this. But the moment you hear the word limited, your brain flips. Because if you wait, it might be gone. So you click, you buy, you hoard. Not out of need, but out of fear. This doesn't just happen in shopping, it happens in love. Ever been ghosted by someone you didn't care that much about, and suddenly they become the only person you think about? Their absence increases their value. They're not better, they're just gone. Scarcity rewrites the story. Even abusive relationships use this dynamic. A partner threatens to leave, withdraws affection, creates distance, and suddenly, you're chasing them. Not because they were kind, but because they became scarce. And the brain, desperate to resolve that loss, elevates their worth. People call it obsession. But really, it's scarcity doing the math. You can see this in parenting, too. A child ignores a toy for weeks until another child picks it up. Now it's the most important object in the room. They didn't change their mind, they just saw it become unavailable. And that alone made it precious. Now let's go darker. Historically, scarcity has been used to control populations, not just of goods, but of freedom. In totalitarian regimes, information is limited, books are banned, news is censored, choice is removed. And as a result, what little remains gains immense emotional value. The single radio broadcast, the underground novel, the rumor passed in whispers. It's not that these things were inherently magical, it's that you couldn't have them. And what you can't have becomes holy. This effect can even work backwards. The moment something becomes common, it's devalued. The band you loved loses its magic once it's on the radio every hour. The shirt you wore proudly feels cheap once everyone else has it. The rare becomes dull. The unreachable becomes sacred. And in a world of endless choice, scarcity becomes curated. Now brands manufacture exclusivity. Artists limit print runs. Apps require invitations. Communities close their doors. Because they know the psychology. If you make something hard to access, people will crawl through glass for it. Now think about how this plays out in society. Limited access to education makes elite degrees seem mystical. Limited access to healthcare turns basic treatment into a class marker. Limited access to beauty, sculpted by scarcity-based fashion and plastic surgery, makes people believe worth is something you earn. By paying for what others can't, even morality is affected. Religions have long used scarcity to assign value. Only a chosen few enter heaven. Only a select group is saved. Only this path leads to truth. And when entry is scarce, it feels more sacred because deep down your brain still believes that anything rare must be good, even if it's not, even if it's poison, even if it's a lie. And sometimes the scarcity is social. Someone gives you a gift, not out of generosity, but to put you in their debt. Because once you've received something rare, you feel pressure to return the favor, to say yes, to comply. It's not gratitude, it's reciprocity. And it's one of the oldest, most dangerous tricks in persuasion. Reciprocity trap. Why you're owned by a free gift. They handed you a flower. You didn't ask for it. You didn't want it. But now it's in your hand. And they're smiling. So you reach into your wallet. This wasn't generosity. It was a transaction you didn't agree to. You've just been caught in one of the oldest psychological traps in human history, reciprocity. And it's not about gratitude. It's about control. Here's the rule. If someone gives you something, you feel compelled to give something back. Not because they asked, but because you feel it. It's automatic, uncomfortable, psychologically violent in its subtlety. The anthropologist Alvin Goldner described this as a universal social norm found in every human culture. You don't take without giving. Seems fair, right? But what happens when that instinct is weaponized? In one famous study, researchers sent holiday cards to complete strangers. Just a basic card, no explanation. And what happened? Most people sent a card back. They didn't know who sent it, didn't ask why. They just felt the need to respond. The trap had already closed. This is the same technique used by street hustlers, cult recruiters, and marketers. You walk by a table, someone hands you a free sample, or a bracelet, or a book, and suddenly you feel an invisible pressure to listen, to donate, to buy. That's not your decision. That's the reciprocity reflex. And it runs deeper than most people realize. Because it doesn't matter if you wanted the gift. The moment you receive it, even unwillingly, your brain flags a debt. The Hare Krishna movement mastered this in the 1970s. They would stand in airports, offering flowers to strangers before asking for donations. Even when people tried to refuse, they'd insist. Wait, it's a gift. Keep it. Once it was in your hands, they asked for a contribution. And more often than not, they got one. Not because people believed in the cause, not because they were interested, but because the flower made them feel obligated. It's psychological blackmail, dressed as kindness. Now take this idea into darker territory. Gangs and organized crime groups often start with favors. A ride, protection, a little help getting a job. They don't ask for payment. Not yet. They let the debt build. And when it's time to collect, you don't say no, because now you owe them. They gave you something when no one else would. And whether or not you asked for it, you're now in the trap. Even in toxic relationships, this shows up. Someone showers you with affection early on. Gifts, attention, praise. They don't ask for anything in return until they do. And when they do, you feel stuck. Because you remember how they gave so much. And now it's your turn, right? The generosity was a setup. The love bomb was bait. Even in childhood, this pattern starts early. A teacher gives you a reward, and suddenly you behave better in class. Not because you learned right from wrong, but because you're now in a transactional loop. You start to believe that doing the right thing only matters when it earns you something. And this transactional mindset follows you into adulthood, into work, into friendships, into how you treat yourself. You start keeping score. You start believing that every good deed must be matched, or returned, or held in secret resentment. And worse, you start seeing other people's generosity as a trap, because it often is. And that's the truly disturbing part. Even when someone is being sincere, when their kindness is real, your brain doesn't always know the difference. You still feel pressure to repay them. You still question their motives. Because once the gift is in your hands, your brain flags a social contract, real or imagined. And breaking that contract feels like betrayal. Even if it wasn't fair, even if you never agreed, even if it costs you your time, your peace, or your freedom. So the next time someone gives you something, ask yourself, was this a gift or was it bait? Did I ask for it? Or was it placed in my hands so I'd feel just uncomfortable enough to say yes to something I wouldn't have considered to 5 minutes ago? Because the most dangerous chains don't look like chains. They look like favors. Mere exposure effect. Why familiar lies feel friendly. You see a face once, just for a second, then again in a different context, and again later in a crowd. By the fourth time, they feel trustworthy. But why? They haven't said a word. They haven't done anything. They've simply been there. And now they feel familiar, comfortable, safe. That's the mere exposure effect, a psychological illusion where repeated exposure to something makes you like it more, even if it's meaningless, wrong, or dangerous. It's not logic. It's not evidence. It's just repetition. And it works. This effect was first studied by Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. He showed people a series of random stimuli, nonsense words, foreign symbols, unfamiliar faces. The more often people saw the same item, the more they reported liking it, not understanding it, not knowing why, just liking it more. Exposure alone created preference, and marketers knew this long before science caught up. Repetition is the foundation of advertising, not persuasion, not reason, just presence. You see a logo on a billboard, on your feed, on a cup, in a jingle, and it starts to feel right. Even if it's junk, even if it's unethical, even if it's killing you. Think of cigarette ads from the 1950s. They weren't about facts. They were about repetition. Smooth, cool, masculine, independent. Same phrases, same visuals, over and over, until death became a lifestyle. The mere exposure effect does something subtle to the mind. It builds fluency. The brain loves fluency. Things it can process quickly and with minimal effort. If a sentence is familiar, if a face is recognizable, if an idea has been heard before, the brain tags it as safe. And once something feels safe, you lower your defenses, which is exactly what propaganda relies on. It's not the first time you hear a lie that makes it powerful. It's the 50th. The repetition makes it sticky. Now think about political slogans. Make America great again. Take back control. Build the wall. Freedom isn't free. It's not about meaning. It's about familiarity. Each time you hear it, it wears a groove into your brain, until the phrase feels inevitable, even if it's empty, even if it's harmful, even if it contradicts itself. Now imagine how this plays out in relationships. You hear the same excuse enough times, and you stop questioning it. I was just tired. You're too sensitive. You always do this. Not because it's convincing, but because it's familiar. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort silences doubt. Even abusive dynamics benefit from the mere exposure effect. When pain becomes routine, it becomes normalized. You've seen it before, so your brain no longer flags it as wrong. It's just Tuesday. And then there's media. A headline flashes across your feed 10 times. You didn't even click it. But now, somewhere in your subconscious, it feels like a fact because you've seen it. That's all it takes. No evidence, no credibility, just exposure. And once something feels true, you start to build around it. You repeat it. You defend it, even if it's fiction. This is why conspiracy theories flourish in algorithmic environments. You don't need a strong argument. You just need volume. Repeat the same claim across dozens of videos, memes, forums, tweets, and the idea becomes sticky. Not because it's right, but because it's rehearsed. The mere exposure effect makes familiarity feel like truth. And that turns the world into a feedback loop. You see what you've seen before. You like what you've liked before. You believe what you've already been told. And everything else, too foreign, too strange, too wrong. Even if it's right, even if it's what you needed to hear, even if it would have saved you. That's the cruelty of it. Familiarity doesn't care if something's good. It only cares if it's repeated, which means the most dangerous ideas are the ones that show up quietly, consistently, until your brain stops checking if they ever made sense in the first place. Variable rewards. Why uncertainty keeps you addicted. A rat presses a lever and gets a pellet. It presses again, gets another pellet. Soon it's pressing steadily, calmly, with predictable hunger. But if the pellet only comes sometimes, randomly, unpredictably, the rat doesn't just press the lever, it starts smashing it like its life depends on it. It's no longer eating, it's gambling. This is called variable reward scheduling, and it is the most addictive reinforcement pattern ever discovered. You don't get rewarded every time. You get rewarded sometimes, and that sometimes is what drives you insane. In 1957, psychologist B.F. Skinner noticed that his lab animals didn't behave the same when rewards were irregular. A rat that once calmly pressed a lever for food now became agitated, obsessive, irrational, pushing again and again with increased force and speed, even if no food appeared for long stretches of time. Why? Because the possibility of a reward is more powerful than the certainty of one. Your brain learns very quickly that when a system gives you something good at unpredictable intervals, the only way to keep the reward flowing is to keep trying and trying and trying. You've experienced this. Everyone has. You check your phone. No message. Check again. Still nothing. Check again. Dopamine hit. A notification. A like. A text. Jackpot. And now you can't stop. You're not checking because there's something new. You're checking because there might be. The modern world has turned you into that rat, pawing at a lever that sometimes gives a pellet. Your lever just looks like a touchscreen. This same principle is what powers casinos. Slot machines are designed on variable reward schedules. You pull the lever, and most of the time, nothing happens. But every once in a while, the lights flash, coins fall, sounds play, and you win a little. And that little win keeps you hooked. But here's the disturbing part. It works even if the total payout is less than what you put in. Your brain doesn't care about net gain. It cares about possibility, the fantasy of winning, the maybe, and that's enough. In fact, the brain starts releasing more dopamine in anticipation of the reward than from the reward itself. You get high from the hope, not the outcome. Social media uses this. So do dating apps, and video games, and email, and even your relationships. If someone always compliments you, the effect wears off. You start expecting it. But if someone praises you unpredictably, sometimes intensely, sometimes coldly, sometimes nothing at all, you get stuck. You keep trying harder. You want to earn the approval again. You crave it, obsess over it. That's how emotionally abusive relationships often work. It's called intermittent reinforcement. You don't know when love is coming, so you overperform to get it back, like a rat at a lever. like a human checking a phone. This is also why people stay in terrible jobs. You hate it, you want to quit, but every once in a while your boss gives you a compliment, a promotion possibility, a raise hint, and that's enough to keep you performing like a machine. Because unpredictability hijacks your attention, it makes you overestimate the value of the next event. It makes you feel like you're about to win. You're about to be noticed. You're about to get better if you just try one more time. And even if the next reward never comes, you're already trapped in the loop. This is how TikTok works. You scroll and see nothing of interest. Then something mildly amusing. Then nothing again. Then a video that grabs you. And now you're chasing the next one. You don't stop because you're satisfied. You stop because you're exhausted. Apps are designed to exploit the variable reward loop, not just deliver pleasure, but to deliver it unpredictably. And once your brain adapts, consistent reward feels boring, too safe, too slow. Which means healthy routines start to feel like punishment. Predictable people start to feel dull. Real life, with its steady rhythms and delayed gratification, starts to feel like it's not enough. Your attention has been conditioned to chase the next flicker of maybe. And the irony, once you become addicted to variable rewards, you start to believe you're making your own choices, that you want this, that you like the game. But really, you're just the lab rat now. You press the lever, you stare at the screen, you hope, and you call that living. Habit loops, the cue, routine, reward prison. You wake up, you reach for your phone, you scroll, you feel nothing, but you keep scrolling. That's not a choice. It's a loop, a habit loop. And once it's installed, it runs itself. Psychologist Charles Duhigg broke this down into 3 parts. Cue, routine, reward. Something in your environment. A cue triggers you. You perform an action, a routine, and you get some kind of result, a reward. Then your brain files that loop away for next time. You don't need to think about it anymore. It just happens. Like brushing your teeth, or tying your shoes, or reaching for alcohol when you're anxious, or zoning out on YouTube when life feels empty, or arguing with your partner using the same cruel script every time, even though you swore you'd stop. Once the loop forms, it doesn't need your permission. Let me give you a disturbing example. In the early 1990s, researchers studied a man known only as EP. He had suffered massive brain damage from viral encephalitis, destroying parts of his hippocampus, the area responsible for forming new memories. He couldn't remember a conversation from 5 minutes ago. He couldn't tell you what he just ate, but he could still go for a walk around the block, even though he had no idea what a block was or where he was. Why? Because habits are stored outside the parts of the brain responsible for conscious memory. They're buried deeper, in the basal ganglia, the primitive machinery. This means you can lose your ability to think, reason, remember, and still keep your habits. The loop survives you. Now look at your own life. You come home from work. You open the fridge. You're not hungry. It's just the loop. Or you feel bored. So you open your phone. Swipe, tap, scroll. You didn't decide to do it. It just happened. You're not reacting to desire. You're reacting to a cue. The smell of popcorn triggers a craving, not because you're hungry, but because your brain has linked it to movie nights and comfort. A notification bell lights up your dopamine system, even if the message is spam, because the loop has been conditioned. Here's the worst part. You can't delete a habit. Once it's carved into your brain, it stays. You can override it, replace it, but the original loop is still there, dormant, ready to wake up again. That's why addiction is so hard to beat. That's why relapse happens without warning. You walk past the old bar. You smell the cigarette smoke. You hear the sound of ice in a glass. Cue, routine, reward. And suddenly, you're not you anymore. You're the pattern. Your conscious brain is just along for the ride. This is how fast food chains trap you. The colors of the logo, the placement of the menu, the smell pumped through the vents. Each piece is a cue. The routine is ordering. The reward is sugar, salt, and fat, a chemical cocktail of satisfaction. Do this enough times, and it's no longer a decision, it's a default. And here's the horrifying twist. You can build a habit loop without even liking the reward. You can keep checking an app that makes you feel empty. You can keep staying in a toxic relationship. You can keep living a life that actively makes you miserable. Because the loop doesn't care how you feel. It only cares if the pattern completes. The brain wants closure. Cue, routine, reward. Cue, routine, reward. It's a machine that doesn't ask questions. You might think your bad habits are mistakes. They're not. They're software, written by your past experiences, your environment, your trauma, and they execute automatically. But here's what makes it even worse. You also have false rewards. Sometimes the loop gives you nothing, but your brain expects a reward, so it hallucinates one. That moment of relief when you vent your anger, it fades instantly, but your brain marks it as a win. That doom-scrolling session that left you feeling worse? Your brain still says, did task, received signal, log loop. Even pain can be a reward if it ends the tension, which means your habits aren't just about pleasure, they're about completion. And once they're installed, you don't live your life. Your loops do. Implementation intentions, how planning turns you into a script. You think your plans give you freedom. That making a to-do list or promising yourself, I'll wake up early tomorrow, is a sign of control, of rational self-mastery. But what if planning is just programming? What if every time you say, if this happens, then I'll do that, you're writing a line of code and then forgetting you ever wrote it? This is the strange power of what psychologists call implementation intentions, tiny scripts you embed into your mind that silently execute later when triggered. The structure is simple. If X happens, then I will do Y. It sounds harmless, helpful, even. If I finish dinner, I'll go for a walk. If it's 8 a.m., I'll start writing. If someone yells at me, I'll stay calm. You rehearse these plans to prepare, but you don't realize what you're really doing. You're delegating your future behavior to a condition. You're binding your reaction to a situation. And eventually, you forget that it used to be a choice. That's how it begins. Control and ends. Automation. In one 1999 study, researchers gave participants a simple task: write about how they would spend Christmas Eve. Half were asked to form an implementation intention, something like, if it's 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, I'll start writing. The other half received no instruction. The results? The people with the if-then script were 2 to 3 times more likely to actually complete the task. Why? Because their brains had outsourced the decision. They didn't have to think about writing. They didn't have to choose in the moment. The script just ran. And that's the disturbing part. Implementation intentions bypass conscious decision-making. They run in the background like malware you installed yourself. Now zoom out. How many of your behaviors were once conscious plans, but now feel like reflexes? If I'm bored, I open Instagram. If I see a red notification, I check it. If I feel rejected, I shut down. If I'm overwhelmed, I quit. You didn't choose these rules. Not anymore. They were written in some forgotten moment of decision. And now they run you. Here's a story that makes it even creepier. In military training programs, soldiers are taught if-then responses for crisis scenarios. If the gun jams, switch to sidearm. If ambushed, take cover and return fire. If separated, rendezvous at fallback point. In the heat of battle, they don't stop and think. They react. They have to. It saves lives. But it also turns a human into a function. This is the trade-off. Implementation intentions increase performance. They reduce friction. They make you more productive, but they also make you predictable, programmable, scriptable. In fact, marketers use them against you. You see a product ad that says, "Next time you're hungry, grab a Snickers." That's not just persuasion. It's an attempt to implant an implementation intention. They're hoping that next time hunger hits, the script runs. You don't ask, "What do I want?" You just obey the code. It works the other way too. People who say, if I'm at a party and someone offers me a drink, I'll say no, are more likely to stay sober. The power of the idea is real. The part we rarely discuss is the cost. You are teaching your brain to run behavior based on conditions, not conscious evaluation. To automate selfhood, to reduce identity into flowcharts, you don't respond, you just trigger. Now think about how many of these you've created accidentally. If I feel sad, I isolate. If someone disrespects me, I get loud. If I'm alone, I fall apart. No one programmed you maliciously. You just kept rehearsing these loops until they became automatic. And the most dangerous part, they don't feel like scripts. They feel like you. Your sense of self gets tangled in your code. You believe the reaction is authentic when it's just something you installed years ago in a different state of mind to solve a different problem in a different life. So maybe planning does help you, but every time you say, if this happens, then I'll do that, ask yourself this. Are you preparing for the future, or are you writing your own cage? The sunk cost of identity. When you can't stop being who you used to be. Let's say you bought a ticket to a movie. Halfway through, it's awful. The plot's a mess. The characters are hollow. You're bored. Do you leave? Most people don't. They say, I already paid for the ticket. So they sit through 2 more hours of something they hate because they used to want it. That's called the sunk cost fallacy, when you keep investing in something just because you've already invested. Now imagine this isn't about a movie. It's about your entire identity. You trained for 10 years to become a lawyer. You hate the job, but you keep showing up. You built a reputation as the funny one, but now you're depressed. And you still keep cracking jokes because it's expected. You got known for being successful, so you don't tell anyone you're falling apart. The moment you build a self, you start protecting it. Even if it's killing you, we don't just fall into the sunk cost trap with money or effort. We fall into it with identity, because the longer you play a role, the harder it is to stop playing it. You can see this with public figures. A politician builds a brand on being tough on crime. Even when new data shows their policies don't work, they double down. Not because it's right, but because backing down means saying, I was wrong. And when your identity is on the line, admitting you were wrong feels like death. This is what psychologist Daniel Kahneman warned about when he said, people would rather be consistent than correct. Why? Because consistency feels safe, predictable, respected. Changing your mind means risking shame. Changing your path means risking regret. So instead, we lock ourselves into who we used to be. Let me tell you a true story. There was a woman who spent 2 decades rising in corporate life. Late nights, promotions, applause. Her identity was built on being unstoppable. But one day she broke down crying in her car. Every morning, she hated who she'd become, but she stayed. Because leaving meant wasting 20 years. It meant explaining to everyone why she gave it up. It meant saying the scariest thing. That wasn't the real me. We don't want to waste our story, so we keep performing it. This happens in relationships too. You stay with someone because you've been through so much. Not because it's good, but because leaving feels like throwing away all that pain, and you want the pain to mean something, so you keep going. You call it loyalty. But sometimes it's just identity inertia. There's a reason people say midlife crisis. It's not just about age. It's about hitting a wall where the self you built no longer fits. But you've spent so long building it, you don't know who you are without it. You can even become trapped in the identity of a victim, or a savior, or the one who never needs help. These aren't just beliefs. They're emotional investments. And like a bad stock, we're terrified to sell low. So we hold on longer than we should. Even pain can become part of identity. I'm the one who was betrayed. I'm the one who never fits in. I'm the one who gets things done no matter what. And the longer you repeat it, the more it hardens. Your past becomes your prison. And every time you try to escape, you hear a voice, sometimes your own, say, after all this time, You're just going to walk away, as if the life you used to want has the right to own you forever. That's the sunk cost of identity. And most people never notice it because it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like you, but it's not you. It's just a very old version of you that you keep feeding, and every day you choose not to question it, you reinforce it. You're not continuing because it's right. You're continuing because you already started. But there's something worth remembering. You don't have to become the person your past decided. You don't have to keep living out the echo of who you were 5 years ago. The cost is sunk. You're allowed to walk out of the theater, even if the movie's half over, even if you already paid. Emotional contagion. Why other people's moods control you. You don't need to hear a word. Sometimes you just walk into a room and feel it. The tension, the fear, the gloom. It's as if someone else's mood has reached inside your brain and flipped a switch you didn't even know was there. That's not a metaphor. It's emotional contagion, a psychological mechanism so powerful you catch feelings the way you catch a cold. There's a study from 1993 that tracked nurses in a neonatal ICU. When one nurse had a high-stress day, the heart rates and oxygen levels of the infants changed, even without direct contact. Another study had people silently watch videos of facial expressions. Not dramatic ones, just subtle shifts in happiness, anger, sadness. Within seconds, their own expressions and heart rates began to sync. Not consciously, not deliberately. They didn't even realize it was happening. This is your brain's default wiring. You mirror the emotions of others, automatically, viscerally, even when it hurts you. Here's why. From the moment you're born, your survival depends on reading other people. If your caregiver is calm, you're calm. If they're anxious, you feel unsafe. The infant doesn't know why they're crying. They just cry when you do. Now you grow up. You think you're more independent, but you walk past a stranger with a scowl, and your body tightens. You sit next to someone nervous on a plane, and your stomach turns. You spend 5 minutes with a depressed friend, and suddenly your thoughts darken, even if your day had been fine. Most of us like to believe that we think first, then feel. But in reality, we often feel first because someone else felt it, and then invent a reason afterward. That's not a bug. It's a survival feature. In group living species like primates or humans, emotional synchronization increases cohesion. If everyone runs from the threat together, more survive. If everyone celebrates the kill together, the tribe stays bonded. So we developed mirror neurons, brain cells that fire not just when you feel something, but when you see someone else feel it. It's empathy on autopilot, and it doesn't stop at facial expressions. You copy postures, speech rhythms, even blinking rates. Ever notice how someone yawns, and then 5 others yawn within seconds? It's not just sleepiness, it's social alignment. You don't choose it, you become it. But here's where it turns dark. You're not just syncing with others, you're being manipulated by it. In marketing, researchers have found that putting you near happy people in ads, even if they're actors, can increase your willingness to buy, not because you believe them, but because your body feels the mood first and then assumes the product caused it. In politics, emotional contagion is weaponized. Crowds are stirred into anger by the emotional tone of the speaker, not necessarily the logic of their words. Once one person starts shouting, others join. Not because they understand, but because they're infected. You can see this online too. In 2014, Facebook conducted a massive experiment on hundreds of thousands of users. By altering their news feeds, they showed one group more negative posts, another group saw more positive ones. Result: the people who saw more negativity started posting more negative things themselves. People who saw more joy posted happier content. No one told them to do it. No one explained what was happening. It just spread, like a virus. And you felt it too. You spend 10 minutes doom scrolling and your chest tightens. You watch a friend spiral on Instagram and your own thoughts start to spiral. You sit next to someone bitter and suddenly everything feels harder. but you don't trace it back to them. You think it's your own feeling. That's the trap. Emotional contagion doesn't come with a warning label. It just enters your system, changes your chemistry, and vanishes without a trace, leaving you to explain it however you can. Sometimes you don't even know who you are when you're alone. Because you've spent so long absorbing other people's moods, you've never learned where yours begin. And the worst part? Some people know this. Toxic personalities use emotional contagion like a lever. They sulk to make you feel guilty. They erupt so you feel small. They manipulate mood like a puppeteer. Because they know if they feel it hard enough, you'll feel it too. It's not just emotional, it's mechanical. And in a world of endless feeds, constant noise, and artificial influencers, your emotions aren't really yours anymore. They're a product of proximity, of algorithms, of invisible signals you never asked for, which means your mind isn't just yours either. It's shared, leaking, vulnerable. You're not an island. You're a tuning fork, and the world is striking you constantly. Decision fatigue. Why your last choice is always the worst. You think you're in control. You wake up, check your phone, choose an outfit, pick breakfast, skim emails, reject a spam call, reply to a message, scroll past 3 headlines, click on one, then close it. That's 17 decisions before you even stand up, and your brain is already tired. This is decision fatigue, the slow erosion of your cognitive strength with every choice you make. You don't notice it. That's the trap. Let's go back to a now famous 2011 study from Israeli parole boards. Judges were asked to rule on whether prisoners should be granted parole. Same crime, same request, same paperwork. In the morning, about 65% of prisoners were granted parole. By afternoon, that number dropped to almost 0. Not because the cases changed, not because the judges became cruel, because after making hundreds of micro-decisions all day, they defaulted to the easiest option: no, default, reject, D4. That's the core of decision fatigue. The more choices you make, the worse you get at choosing. You might think, but I don't make that many important decisions in a day. Because your brain doesn't differentiate between big and small. Should I wear the black socks or the blue ones? Should I respond now or later? Should I try a new cafe or stick with the old one? Every one is a tiny withdrawal from a limited mental budget, and by the time you're choosing what to eat for dinner, you don't want what's healthy, you want what's easy. That's why stores put candy at the checkout. Why streaming services autoplay whatever's next. Why apps nudge you with default settings. They're counting on your exhaustion. They want your choices to be bad, because bad choices are predictable. Look at online behavior. Why do you buy something you didn't need? Add 3 more things to your cart, and forget why you even opened the website? Because that impulse hit after a day of thousands of invisible mental clicks, each one making you a little more likely to say yes to the wrong thing. And this isn't just marketing, it's survival. You evolve to conserve energy. Your brain burns calories with every decision. Too many, and it starts shutting down complex reasoning. That's when heuristics kick in. Mental shortcuts. Do what you did last time. Copy what others do. Choose the default. And those shortcuts, they're easy to exploit. Ever wonder why fast food menus have too many options? It's not generosity. It's strategy. They overload you with choices, counting on your mental fatigue to push you toward the bright red combo with the word popular next to it. Decision fatigue doesn't just make you lazy, it makes you vulnerable. That's why interrogations often go on for hours. Not because the suspect is resisting, but because the officers know as exhaustion creeps in, resistance drops. Eventually you'll sign what they put in front of you. It's why authoritarian systems work overtime to flood you with rules. Make every step feel like a choice. What to say, what to wear, how to stand, until your mind stops challenging and just follows. Even parenting shows it. Give a toddler 3 toy choices. They pick one. Give them 20. They collapse, cry, or shut down completely. Adults do the same. We just do it quietly. We freeze. We disengage, or we surrender to the loudest voice in the room. You think you're tired because of work, or sleep, or stress. But sometimes, you're just tired from the crushing weight of constant invisible decisions. And in those moments, you are most programmable because a tired brain doesn't fight. It nods, it clicks, it accepts. And the system knows it. The worst part isn't that you make bad decisions. It's that you don't even realize you stopped making them. The illusion of choice is preserved, but the will behind it is gone. Availability bias. Why you believe what's easiest to recall. You're walking alone at night and you hear footsteps behind you. Your pulse quickens. You imagine a mugger, a shadow, a crime scene. Why? Because you've seen that movie, read that headline, heard that podcast. It's in your memory, so your brain pulls it forward and tells you, this is reality. This is availability bias, the mental shortcut where you judge how likely something is based on how easily it comes to mind. Your brain doesn't measure facts. It measures accessibility. It doesn't ask, what's the statistical chance of this happening? It asks, what's the first example I can remember? And whatever floats to the top, whether it's true, exaggerated, or fictional, becomes your reality. Think of plane crashes. They're rare. Insanely rare. You're more likely to die slipping in the bathroom than in a commercial airplane. But when a crash does happen, it's everywhere. 24-hour coverage, graphics, animations, interviews with survivors, dramatizations. So next time you board a flight, your brain plays that memory reel, and suddenly flying feels terrifying because your brain confuses vividness with frequency. You don't feel fear because of logic. You feel fear because you can remember fear. The news knows this. That's why it's never just car accident. It's gruesome crash, young mother, 6-year-old injured drunk driver still at large. Why? Because details stick. And the more detailed a story is, the more available it becomes in your memory. And the more you believe, it reflects reality. And it's not just fear. Think about crime. In most developed countries, crime has been declining for decades. But if you ask people, they believe it's getting worse. Why? Because crime stories dominate attention, and what dominates attention becomes typical in your mind. You see one viral video of a robbery, you hear one dramatic 911 call, and your brain tells you, this must be happening everywhere. It's the same with terrorism, kidnappings, school shootings, rare events, but memorable, and therefore mentally inflated. Now here's where it turns dark. Marketers, politicians, and media exploit this constantly. They don't have to convince you with data. They just need to make the idea easy to recall. You don't need to understand the economy. You just need to remember that one gas price photo, that one closed sign, that one panicked voice. You don't need to understand immigration policy. You just need to remember one clip of a chaotic border scene. You don't need to know science. You just need to remember one video of a vaccine side effect, even if it was rare or even faked. Your memory becomes your belief system, and your memory is engineered. In one classic study, people were asked, are there more words in the English language that start with the letter K, or more words with K as the third letter? Almost everyone said, more words that start with K. Why? Because it's easier to recall kite, king, or kind than to search your mind for words like bake or lake. But in reality, there are twice as many words with K in the third position. Your brain didn't scan reality. It scanned what was easy. And that's what you always do. Even with your own life. Think about someone you dislike. Try remembering something good they did. Hard, right? But if you're already angry, your brain filters for the available memories, the betrayals, the tone of voice, the one time they embarrassed you. That's not a full picture. That's availability bias. Now scale it up. Think about how this shapes your view of whole countries, cultures, religions, professions. One bad headline about a cop or a protester or a politician, and that's what your brain holds. One shocking incident, one graphic video, one emotional tweet, and it becomes your baseline. Not because it's accurate, but because it's easy to retrieve. The human mind is lazy, not in a bad way, but in an efficient way. We evolved to make snap judgments, because in the wild, hesitation was dangerous. If one person saw a predator, the whole tribe avoided that path, even if the other 99 times it was safe. And today, we do the same. Except now, your tribe is a feed, and every terrifying or dramatic post becomes part of your internal world. What you see is what you think. What you remember is what you believe. And what's repeated is what you trust. Not because it's true, but because it's close, because it's available. Choice overload. Why too much freedom paralyzes you. You walk into a store. There are 24 kinds of jam. Strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, mango peach, triple berry, organic, local, low sugar, sugar-free, seedless. You taste a few. You browse the labels. You read the price tags. And then you walk away with nothing. This isn't laziness. It's not indecisiveness. It's what psychologists call choice overload, the paralyzing effect of too many options. More freedom sounds good, but at a certain point, it becomes a trap. Let's go back to the famous jam study from Columbia University. 2 tables were set up in a grocery store. One offered 6 kinds of jam, the other 24. More people stopped at the 24 jam table. It was more exciting, more colorful, more inviting. But when it came time to buy, people who saw fewer options were 10 times more likely to actually make a purchase. That's right, 10 times more. The big display got more attention, but the small one got more action. Why? Because your brain isn't built for this. You evolved in a world with scarcity, a world where option meant which route won't poison me. Today, you can't even order coffee without being asked. Small, medium, large, extra large, iced, hot, oat, soy, almond, whole, sugar, no sugar, extra shot. Each micro-decision feels small, but your brain treats every one like it matters. And by the end, you're exhausted and strangely dissatisfied. Because here's the dark part. The more options you have, the more you fear you picked the wrong one. Imagine buying a TV. You spend 3 hours comparing specs. You read 20 reviews. You toggle between 5 online stores. You finally click buy. And then the doubt creeps in. What if the other model had better contrast? What if tomorrow it goes on sale? What if you overlooked something? More choices don't just drain you. They haunt you. You don't feel empowered. You feel responsible for your own regret. And the system loves that. Because the illusion of choice makes you feel like you're in control, even as you're being manipulated. Streaming platforms give you endless options, not to free your mind, but to paralyze you into letting autoplay take over. Online stores flood you with filters, bundles, customers also bought, prompts, not to help you decide, but to delay you long enough to trigger impulse. Even in dating, apps offer you hundreds, sometimes thousands of potential matches. And what happens? You swipe endlessly. You become pickier. You start shopping for humans like products. You can't connect because your brain thinks there's always a better option. One swipe away, more choice becomes less commitment. More options mean less meaning. And this seeps into everything. Jobs, friends, vacations, books, even beliefs. When there are too many ideologies, too many identities, too many truths to choose from, you start opting out of choosing entirely. You become passive. You become detached. You float between options without ever diving in, and slowly you lose the ability to decide who you are. In a world of infinite possible selves, you become no one. This is why authoritarian systems often do the opposite. They give you no choice. One party, one belief, one channel, one product. And ironically, some people feel relieved because it's simpler, it's easier. It removes the burden of deciding. That's the trade-off. Choice gives freedom, But too much choice kills action. And that's where you are now. Doom-scrolling menus, paralyzed on streaming platforms, reading reviews instead of living experiences. The more options you get, the less real life you actually choose. Personalization trap, how algorithms build your identity. You think you're shaping your world. You click on a video, you scroll past a headline, you like a post, ignore another, linger on a reel for 3 seconds too long, and just like that, the machine watches. It adjusts. It learns. But you don't notice it. You just think, weird? I was just thinking about that. As another eerily relevant ad pops up. That's not coincidence. That's the personalization trap, and it's building you. Let's start with the myth. You believe you use the algorithm, but the truth is, the algorithm uses you. It's not just recommending content. It's shaping your preferences, day by day. It's creating an echo chamber where the loudest voice is your own reflection. And the more it reflects, the more you mistake it for who you really are. Let's walk through it. You watch one video on conspiracy theories, just out of curiosity. The next day, the algorithm suggests 3 more, then 5. Then a live stream titled, "They don't want you to know this." You didn't plan to go down that rabbit hole. But by the end of the week, you're starting to wonder if maybe the moon landing really was fake. You didn't choose this path. It was chosen for you, and it felt like your idea. That's what makes it dangerous. It's not mind control. It's identity drift. And it's so slow you don't notice. You believe you're exploring freely, but you're being nudged, subtly, over and over, toward a version of yourself that's more predictable, more extreme, more profitable. Here's the disturbing part. The personalization engine doesn't just tailor content to your preferences. It shapes your preferences. Watch more fitness videos. Suddenly you feel inadequate in your body. Linger on luxury lifestyle posts. You begin to feel poor. Browse posts about loneliness. Your recommended breakup stories, depressive content, grief. The algorithm doesn't care how you feel. It cares what keeps you scrolling, and it's discovered something terrifyingly efficient. Your pain is more profitable than your happiness. You don't need to buy anything, just exist. Just feel something strong enough to keep tapping. And because the system is too complex to fully audit, even the people who built it can't say for sure why you're seeing what you're seeing, or who you're becoming as a result. That's how radicalization happens. That's how identity morphs into performance. One day you're a casual viewer. 2 weeks later, you're convinced you've done the research. And all along, the algorithm smiles. Because it's not malicious, it's not even sentient, it's just math. Optimization. Feedback loop. But the outcome is disturbingly human. You're now a product. A sellable identity with a label, a niche, a belief system, assembled not by introspection, but by statistical convergence. Worse, the more personalized your world becomes, the smaller it gets. You no longer see conflicting views. You no longer hear dissent. You no longer experience friction. And without friction, there is no growth. Personalization becomes a velvet prison, one where everything fits, but nothing surprises. One where you're always comfortable, but never truly free. And you'll stay there, scrolling, nodding, believing, thinking you're exploring, while slowly becoming a stranger to the version of you that used to wonder what existed outside the feed. This isn't the future. This is now, and the longer you stay inside the loop, the harder it becomes to remember who you might have been before the machine learned your name. So now we close the journey. 30 psychological switches. 30 ways your mind can be rewired without your permission. Most of them already are. And you didn't even notice. Now go ahead. Try to figure out which thoughts are yours. We'll be watching. Sleep well.